down the hallway, so if you, there may be slower spots in this presentation because I'm going to do a lot of sanding and stuff. If you want to jump out and go catch some of that, my friend Ian Davlin is doing a neck removal without steam presentation. So any of you who are interested in catching a little bit of that, please feel free to jump out, go see that, come back, go back and forth. I gave him fair warning, people might be popping in and out, so don't be concerned about any of that. So, and now anyone who wasn't here needs, anybody who doesn't have an outline? So these, I want to make sure everybody's got it. So anybody who wasn't here yesterday and has questions on the outline, feel free to, I'm happy to go over some of the stuff I did yesterday for the benefit of people that weren't present. Didn't make it.
Yeah.
Something else. Otherwise. All right, so it's 9 o'clock basically. So, all right, so this is French polishing for guitar makers, the sequel. And yesterday, if you were here, we went over preparation in terms of prepping the guitar, the instrument for polish in terms of sanding and filling and sealing. We went through the spit coating, and then I demonstrated the application, talk about application sequence in terms of which surfaces of the guitar I do in terms of first, second, and third. The fact that the guitar is spit coated in its entirety with a light, well-thin coat of shellac to seal everything, and then the concentrate on the back and sides as a unit, and on guitars which have the neck attached also include the heel portion in that sequence. Wait till the back and sides are substantially bodied up before doing the top, mainly because any accidents you might have doing the back and sides if the top is already done, you're going to have to redo the top. And then the neck for an attached body would be top and peg head, and then obviously for a detached neck like this one, you can just proceed on it independently from the body. And then the last of the sequence is the shaft of the neck, which you need, in a practical sense, you need to be able to handle this. And so today I'm gonna, yeah.
Maybe it's just my age, but I have trouble swinging the guitar around like that without winding up touching a wet corner or a pen.
Right. It can be a little unwieldy. Someone just mentioned that they have developed a technique where they basically hold this in a vise and work around, just walk around it and work and just have the guitar stationary, and they move themselves around. And I think that's a perfectly fine way to work if you get used to doing that. You could, I suppose you could even put it on one of those sort of rotisserie things, that they have for guitar finishing, whatever. You could do that as well. Lots of different ways to hold it. I like this way because I can look at it under different angles in the light and it's probably because my vision isn't anything what it used to be. So in order for me to see real surface details, I've got to get good raking light across surfaces now just to be able to see it well, to see if there's a problem.
And just being left-handed, using my right hand to swing it around, I'm having trouble with my thumb.
Right. Yeah, I'm left-handed too, so. Well, I'm just used to doing it, but there is a certain physicality to this. There's a certain amount of pressure, and it does take a certain amount of. It's sort of like isometrics. Yeah, Bill.
You mentioned light. What kind of setup do you have in the area you do?
I just have a basement shop with some of those cheapo $20 fluorescent lights above, and I have I like the, IKEA makes a little flexi light. It's got like a heavy base and it's got like a gooseneck flexi thing. That's like a high intensity light that you can like, it's
You
great
said
for
that it's a raking light kind of?
Yeah, well, I mean, I use these in all sorts of different combinations to try to light what I'm doing, but it usually requires moving the guitar, so I'm getting raking light off the surface to be able to see to really be able to see the surface
I generally
texture.
get the best light if I can get it against the window.
Yeah, and being in a basement shop, I don't have the benefit of, sunlight.
Yeah, I have a basement shop too, and I've installed the LED lamps, fluorescents. It's a natural exchange. And you get brighter light and you get more natural light because they're not nearly as blue.
Right, exactly. Yeah, if you're doing
Really well.
if you're doing color work, you need like 2 or 3 different sources of light to get a full spectrum. Fortunately, I don't worry about so much about color in this particular process, but doing color work under fluorescent light can be very.
I haven't used them in years, but I know that the fluorescent tubes used to be really.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Pretty much so.
Take a photograph under fluorescent light, you got a green picture.
Yeah, I think it's gotten better. I think they're the fluorescents have more of the full spectrum now. But yeah.
David, if you had that by the neck, couldn't you be working on the soundboard as well as the sides and back and then hang it?
You can, Bear, but the problem is you get the soundboard, because the soundboard is, let's assume this is a rosewood guitar with a spruce top, which is probably more typical for the things that I would be doing. The soundboard being very light, once you've developed a nice coat on the soundboard and you're working on the sides, if you drip across that, you basically have to strip it and start from scratch. So it's for that reason I don't do it.
That's right, I remember that. We
Yeah,
mentioned that yesterday.
it's a matter of having done it like once. I decide, okay, I'm going to leave that because you can spend, it's just safer in terms of not having to go back and redo something. Yeah.
You're still learning, it takes 3 or 4 times.
If I just start over again on the guitar, I could just take some alcohol and strip it back. It's not really would that be a better way to get it back?
Yeah. I mean, pretty much if you want to go back to square one, you can just take a wet rag with alcohol and dissolve this right off.
Get it off there.
Yeah. But by the same token, you don't want to spill any alcohol on it or, whatever, because it'll eat right into what you just did. So okay, I'm going to do some sanding now, and I'm using the 3M Gold sandpaper. I get this from StuMac, and I think I bought it. I think LMI has it too. I don't know if anybody, no one in my area carries it locally, so I have to order it. So it's sort of I tend to prefer materials I can buy, locally if I can get them. But this is one of those ones that I can't.
I just wanted to see the band.
Yeah, this is 800 grit at this point. So 800 grit is the point at which I'm sort of the last sanding that I do, with the caveat that sometimes if there's some problems that I want to sort of deal with on a spot basis, I'll move to my micro mesh sanding system and sort of go at them with micro mesh and work up the grits to a polished state. So that's that's more or less dealing with some problems. In other words, if I have a little area that I sanded through and I sort of body it back up, just sort of spot finish it, and then I need to blend it into what's already been completed and polished, I might use the micro mesh to level it and just blend it in. So I wouldn't be using this. And I think the micro mesh starts at 1500 grit, and that corresponds roughly to 400 grit in this series. So you can make the transition from one system to the other if you want. Yes.
How devastating is a sander with shellac?
Not really. It's not really that devastating unless you have a dark shellac on a much lighter wood, and you've built it up so that the overall color is much lighter than the wood much darker than the wood underneath, then you can end up with a light spot. But usually you're going to see that long before you sand through it. You're much more likely to sand through on a dark, like the darker back and sides, because you won't see the difference in color like you would on the top, you know. And but it's still not. I mean, you can spot finish. You can repair areas that you sanded through. And in fact, usually if you sand through with a really fine grit, you've just sanded through the very surface. You've still got all that fill in the pores that you've built up. So you may be able to repair it with just a very few passes. You know, you may be able to do 4 or 5 passes over another hour and then polish it right from there. Because the finish itself is so thin that it'll blend right in. So those are very repairable. But
okay, when you say passes, do you mean very localized, like right in the spot, or kind of the whole?
just localized right in the spot. Yeah, you can spot finish as small an area as you want. You don't have to. You can just finish just that little area where you sand it through, and sort of, I call it massaging. You can massage it and blend it into. Sometimes if you get a little ding, sometimes if you're turning around and bang, then you may have to do a little drop fill with the shellac, which works okay as long as it's not too deep, because remember, shellac has color. So if you've got, say, microscopically, if you've got this much on the surface and then you put a ding in, then you've got this much shellac, so you're going to end up easily with a dark spot. One of the things that I've used to repair that kind of problem is lacquer transfill. You know what that is? It's nitrocellulose lacquer that's been evaporated, so it's very thick, and you use it for drop fill and lacquer finishing. It's pretty clear, so you can build it up and level it, and then fix a defect sometimes using that. But you don't want to have to do that, so just don't ding the guitar as you're working on it. Yeah, Larry. Is that a question you had? No, guess not.
Can you repeat what that product's called?
Oh, it's called I think Balin makes it, lacquer transfill. It's basically a drop. It's a nitrocellulose lacquer that you can use for dropping in, for filling up. Avoid things like cyano, because it's so hard you can't sand it. You won't be able to sand it level without sanding right through the polish around it. When you drop fill a lacquer finish, or if you use cyano to fill a dent in like a lacquer finish, you can get away with it because there's usually a lot of lacquer there, and you can sand that level and still have lacquer. But this you can't. It will go right through. You'll go right through it. And so stay away from cyano in trying to. The best you can do, I think, is shellac itself, a lighter shellac. You have to sort of judge how dark that accumulation is going to be in whatever defect you're filling. Shellac is always the best if you can fill, because it's you might have to do repeated applications to build it up, but it will sand back much more easily, and you'll be much better off. So, yeah.
I've had good luck over the years steaming and so. Do you
yeah.
have drawbacks to that?
Well, you can easily steam a dent out if you've got raw wood, but you're not going to be able to steam a dent out through your shellac finish because you'll melt it. The finish itself is going to melt with the heat. So, yeah, steaming out's great if you've got a raw. But what I'm talking about is dinging the guitar during your finishing process. And there's ways to repair it, but the steaming, unfortunately, isn't one of them. So all right, so I've got 800 grit here, and I'm going to sand this back, and apologies if it starts getting tedious.
You had it overnight dry.
Yeah, it's dry overnight. Now I'm I'll start with a block only because somehow I know I don't know if there are any block autocrats in the audience who feel so strongly about sanding with a block, but you know, I do use this is like the foam pad, rubber pad you get with the micro mesh. I'll start with this because, well, I sort of feel obliged to not encourage bad practices, but I will dispense with it very quickly and sand with my hand and fingers, and I'll explain why. I don't have a good explanation other than I just prefer it, you know. And I think what I'm doing is knocking off the high spots, and I'm watching the surface all the time. I mean, you can see the sort of obviously where you sand becomes matte, you know, becomes a matte area, and the areas that haven't been sanded are still quite shiny, you know, and this is the way it is in any finishing. But I find that what I'm trying to do is to unify that surface, the surface character, so that it all looks basically nice and matte. And I find I can do it best with my fingertips, just sort of selecting where I want and selectively just pressing slightly localized, in a localized manner to get this more consistent.
So Dave, is that because of the straight stroke technique?
Not so much. I think it's because the wood itself, like this wood is quite stripy, and I think basically as you sand it, it becomes a little like this because you have different hardnesses of wood, and the finish is so thin, the wood continues to express itself through the finish. There's not so much finish that you're just sanding the finish. I mean, you are just sanding the finish, but the wood there's not so much finish that the wood is now buried under enough finish so that you can establish some sort of dimensional layer over it. It's still very much whatever the wood was underneath. And this, so now you can see this area that I just did sort of is a little bit more.
You're just wiping with a regular cloth?
Yeah, it's just a cloth. Because this dries very nicely overnight, and pretty much as you sand it, it generates a very fine powder, you know, and that sort of tells you if you're sanding it and you get that nice white powder or slightly amber colored powder, you know that it's cutting nicely and you're getting your shellac is dry the way you want it. If it's a little gummy, then you know you should get. I mean, you can see it on my hand, that this white powder that I'm generating off the surface. So I'm just wiping it off to get a better look at what the surface is, how the surface is developing.
And the sandpaper doesn't load up, and I mean
it will load up after a while, and I'll just discard it and. Actually, I don't throw it away. See, you can see where it's loading up a little bit.
Yeah.
You can see where it's starting to load up, and I don't belabor it. I just change to a new piece of sandpaper. I might keep this piece of sandpaper because it's a little bit worn and might be useful, still useful in certain corners of it to massage an area of finish, and I don't want it to be quite as aggressive as it was when it was new. So I kind of like to, I have a pile of old sandpaper that I sort of go through. Eventually I just throw them away because they're probably beyond their usefulness. But
So Dave, you're never going to achieve like a completely flat.
theoretically, no. What you're gonna get a finish that's as flat as your woodworking was. And that's one of the real keys to French polishing, is that there's very little flaw thickness with French polish. If you got, for lacquer finishing, I was visiting a good friend of mine who does some lacquer finishing for me down near Martin. He worked for Martin for 50 years almost, and is a real expert in finishing guitars. And a lot of times he'll get guitars from beginning makers who are doing, maybe built a guitar in a course or something like that, and they've got wavy sides, and there'll be all sorts of woodworking things, and he's sort of expected to fix them as much as he can, and so it's sort of the bane of his existence. But if you've got a little bit of waviness in the side, he calls it whiskering in. He can whisker in a little lacquer, and he can sort of level things out and fill things in, and there's a lot you can do when you put on six or 8 mils of lacquer, final finish or even more. French polish doesn't do any of that. You're not going to be able to do any of that with French polish. You've got to have a really good surface. Your woodworking has to be impeccable. You really don't have much. There's not much, you don't have much. It doesn't do much for you in terms of that. So, because it's so thin, we're talking maybe 1 to 2 thousandths, if that. I've never even been able to measure this because it's not like you can peel it off and measure it. I'm not even sure. I don't even know how much there is on here in terms of actual thickness, but you can come up and see, and it's very, very thin. So you have to be careful in sanding it back. You don't want to go through it. That's why I'm constantly looking at it. As soon as I get it, as soon as it gets to the point where I'm not seeing shiny areas, I'm done in terms of sanding. Again, this is part of the philosophical adjustment that you may need to make if you want to get into French polishing, and that's guitars are made of wood. Wood has a texture, it has a character. Most modern finishes are designed to obliterate that texture and character and create a smooth, flat, glossy, glassy finish. And you still have the visual characteristics of the wood, but you don't have any of the topography of the wood. Whereas a French polished finish, when it's new, it may look a little bit more slightly more glassy if it's polished out, but it will shrink in, and you will eventually be able to see all of the structure in the wood in 3 dimensions on the surface, which is lovely. When you look at it, it'll be a very nicely prepared surface, but you're going to actually see the wood underneath it because it is so thin. Yeah.
This sanding coat you're doing, this sanding you're doing right now.
Right.
Is this to get a scuff over everything or to level, or both?
It does level things, and that's mostly what it is, I think. It's just bringing the surface back to a certain consistency, because the glazing coat I'm going to put on this, subsequent to my sanding here, is going to be so thin that any anomalies would absolutely show. So this is really, it looks like I'm sanding it, but I'm as much polishing it at this point as I am sanding it. It just isn't shiny yet. Again, it's a matter of, as you go through the pulls and as you go through each series of pulls and applications, application and sanding cycles, you're refining the surface continually, building a little bit up more on it, refining it, using finer and finer paper, and to the point where you're using 800 paper as your final sanding, and then doing your final glazing pulls, which is what I'm going to show you today.
Is there any advantage to going with finer paper than 1,000, 1,500?
I would say I would only go that far after you've completed all your applications. If you really want to go that much further, you're sanding the finished surface in preparation for polishing. I've found that you can go from the final glazing pulls using a buffing wheel and the 85 diamond cut Maguires, you can go right up to a polish. I mean, you know, right, you can jump. There's enough leveling and cutting with that buff, like a foam buffing wheel. That will bring you right up to almost the final polish, and then you might want to use the number 2 fine by hand and the number 4 or the number 7 glaze just to polish it further. So yeah, it's sort of like, you know, it's similar to when you're sanding a guitar body. Most people sand to 150 or 180. Going to 220 or 320 to sand a raw wood body doesn't really gain you much. In fact, it might be detrimental in that it doesn't have as much tooth in the wood to hold that finish where you want it, you know. So it's kind of, because you can pretty much polish it up from this point. Because remember, these are very fine scratches, and they'll pretty much be filled in by the application that I'm going to put on afterwards. So, you know, you're already at a surface which is probably finer than what you're going to get going up further. Yeah.
We're talking about surface that deep that stone. I usually use an acid from start to finish. Get a good low rate angle. I still miss surface.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the thing is too, this is just dry sanding, and I do like this paper because I think it's stearated and it's got a nice. I think it lubricates the paper slightly, so there's a nice sort of smooth feel. It doesn't, you know, skid across the surface like some of the other papers do. And so I see I got a little pinhole here. You can't see it, but it's a little shiny, teeny shiny spot about the size of the head of a pin. So I can massage it a little bit, but I'm just going to sort of, it went away. Okay, well, no, it's really. But
You're not going to drop fill it?
no, it's not bad enough to drop fill. It's very close to the surface, so once it's polished, it'll probably just go away almost. So, all right, so let me wipe this off. This is not, well, it's not 100%. Well, I see a little bit here now. Not 100% maybe, but it's pretty darn close for demonstration purposes to where I want it to be. Light in here is poor too, so it's sort of hard to see it. But okay, so you can see now that it's pretty matte. There's no obvious shiny spots. I've pretty much abraded that entire surface back so that it's uniformly smooth. And all right, now I'm going to do the sides. It'll take me a few minutes to do the sides. So anybody wants to pop out and go see the other. Feel free to ask more additional questions as I do this. Anything you think of.
All right,
It goes pretty quick, but.
I in this first half hour yesterday, and then an overview of what you did.
Yeah.
You talked about egg wash.
Right.
And that was egg white.
Egg white, and the purpose of the egg wash is to seal the various woods against each other so that they don't bleed under the application of the spit coat. The spit coat is the shellac coat that's applied fairly thin, so it's mostly alcohol. And a number of woods, as probably most of you are well aware, things like Brazilian rosewood isn't quite as bad, but Indian rosewood is probably the worst offender in terms of bleeding. And if you apply alcohol, a wet alcohol-based finish to Indian rosewood, it's going to bleed. And if you have wooden bindings or wooden purflings that you can't scrape clean like you can, or marquetries or whatever kind, that you can't scrape clean like you can a plastic binding, you're going to end up with pink everything. So the egg wash, the purpose of the egg wash is to seal those woods from bleeding on the application of the spit coat. So that's really important. I didn't use an egg wash on this guitar because, well, there wasn't really much of anything to bleed into much of anything else. So I dispensed with it on this guitar. But anything else that I would build with this
When you
technique.
apply it, how thick or thin or?
Well, it's egg white, so it's sort of, I mean, as I mentioned yesterday, I just use that very sort of, if you crack an egg, you're going to notice there's obviously the yolk, and then there's the very sort of gelatinous part of the white. And then there's a really sort of liquidy component to the white that will sort of drip out of the egg first. That's what I want, is that really liquid component of the egg white. So that's what it might take 3 or 4 eggs to get enough of that, to sort of try to separate that out and to get enough to do one guitar. But I find the really gelatinous portion of the egg white won't really brush on smoothly. And if you start like working it to get it smooth, it will sort of froth, and you can end up with a little bit of something on the surface which will it'll disrupt. In other words, the surfaces where that froth is dried will look a little different than the surface of the more liquid portion. But I learned that the hard way. So
Nice meringue.
yeah, right. So you don't want the frothiness, so you want to put it on as smoothly and cleanly and as liquidy as you can. If you get a little blob of that thicker stuff, you can tease it off with a brush or sort of dip your brush in selectively into the white that you've got. And
I just want to get clear in my mind what you said yesterday. You use the egg wash just on the lighter wood,
the egg wash goes over the whole thing.
over the whole thing?
Yeah. You just brush the egg wash over the entire instrument because you just want to seal everything because you don't always know what's going to bleed. You know, you could have maybe you used a purfling that, you know, out of some sort of natural wood. Who knows what bloodwood's going to do under alcohol? You know, I mean, you never know. So you just seal the whole thing. Yes, Phil.
Yesterday you were talking about mixing it, and you were saying you really didn't get into like cuts or measuring.
That's right.
Okay. So you said you put in shellac flakes.
Right.
And then just more or less cover them?
Cover them maybe with a little bit extra, not much.
Now, when you do your spit coat,
Right.
do you have a special mix for that?
I sort of pour it out into my container here and maybe cut it 50% so that it's not tremendously thin, but it's easily brushable and it's or pattable, and it's liquid enough so that it is soaking into the wood a bit.
One other thing you mentioned, I want to make sure I understand completely, is a super saturated solution.
Right.
You said when you mix the shellac, you're looking to have enough shellac in it that you have extra granules.
Right. No, it all dissolves to a certain extent, but as you can see, as you can see, there's still some quantity of shellac still sitting on the bottom that isn't completely in solution. That means what shellac is in solution is as much as will go into the alcohol. So that's what I mean by super.
Concentrated as possible.
Yeah, it's supersat. It's seeing that there's actually some sitting on the bottom that isn't dissolved. It's super saturated. In other words, there's more shellac in this than there is alcohol, enough alcohol to completely dissolve it. So because this is super saturated, I pretty much know what the cut is. I know it's at the max, so I can work it back from there. Rather than putting some alcohol in and then putting sort of an indeterminate quantity of flakes in, and it dissolves completely, but then you really don't know what you got unless you've somehow calculated it carefully, and that's a drag. Wants to do that. So this is just much easier. You just mix up a supersaturated solution and then work out of it, and thin it varying amounts as you proceed. Yeah.
Just for reference in my mind, what color shellac are you actually using?
This one is this is the LMI number 3. So
That's the number 3.
yeah, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is right in the middle of the range color-wise of what they have. So let's you know, I'd call it a nice darker amber shellac if I had to, as opposed to a garnet shellac, which is like quite red, like you think of a garnet color, or a blonde shellac, which is obviously very light colored. So this is sort of a medium dark amber color. It's just about the color of real amber, actually. So it's, yeah.
So when you're spit coat, are you using the same actual color shellac? That
Yes. Oh yeah. Same material. It's just you're just thinning it a little bit so that you get you get good penetration into the wood. You get it as much into the wood as you can get, as the wood really wants to absorb. The wood actually it isn't as absorptive as you think it is. In other words, it's not like a sponge. It won't pull in all that much, but you want it to be absorbed into the surface to the max, because if you don't get it absorbed into the surface completely to the max, you may end up with areas of the guitar which don't look like other areas of the guitar. You want to have it uniform.
On this, like spruce, with the varying grains, that can get a little splotchy that way. Are you use the egg wash helping prevent that, or?
No, the egg wash, well, the egg washes will be absorbed to varying degrees in terms of what the wood is like too. So, because you're dealing with wood and wood has anomalies, you're always going to get a certain variation due to the grain of the wood. If you've got a top that has a little bear claw in it where the grain is jumping up and down, you're going to have a little bit of variation in how it absorbs both the egg wash and the finish. Not so bad with the egg wash because it's really clear. It's clear, so it doesn't show variation any more than it would if you wet it with a wet cloth. So, and when you take wood and you wet it with a cloth, you get an idea of what it's going to look like under finish. You see all the variances in the grain of the wood, but you're just wetting it, and it's sort of the same with the egg wash. Shellac is a little different in that it's got color, so areas that might be absorbed more might have more contrast, but it's part of the fun working with wood. Yeah.
Yeah, about the egg wash, how long are we letting that sit?
I let it sit overnight. I let it dry overnight. It dries completely overnight.
And then is there sanding back? Everything like that?
Presumably you've raised the grain on the instrument with moisture prior to your final sanding. So the egg white should not raise the grain appreciably. If you do get a little bit of grain raising and it feels like it's a little nubbly, you can knock off the high spots a little bit with a little sandpaper. But you don't want to, if it feels a little, rough or granular, you can do that. But you want to stay away from the areas that that are next to different woods, because you don't want to sand through the seal.
I'm more worried about the egg white hardening into like little ripples or something like that you can sand backwards and not work like that, because it just soak in.
If you stick with a really liquid portion, it's just it goes on very smoothly. And
did you add that on, or you said you use a brush?
I use a fine art like an artist sable brush that's sort of a flat, wide flat artist brush.
Is there any reason why, if you're not used to brushing technique, you could patent on it, or could you do that?
I guess you could. It was sort of kind of a mess. I like, brushing it on. It's not like brush. It doesn't take any brushing skill like something like the varnish does. You have to practice with a brush to put on varnish. It's tough. This is like brushing. I don't know. It's easy to brush on. It's easy to smooth out. It's not. Yeah.
Tying into what he's talking about, in your surface prep, which we covered at the beginning of yesterday, and I missed some of it. So, when you're raising the grain, you're doing a wet sanding.
Right.
And you probably covered that with everybody, but then when you dry sand it after that to clear it off, how fine did you go through it?
That last sanding after I raised the grain is probably 150 to 180, I'm saying, it depends. I can't always get 180 locally, so sometimes
What
it's,
did you use for wet sanding?
oh, I don't wet sand at all,
You don't?
no.
Okay, so when you say you raise the grain,
I just use a moist cloth.
okay.
Cloth moistened with water and wipe it down, and then I don't let it sit that long. Sometimes I use a hair dryer to dry it quickly, you know, and up comes the grain, and then I knock it down with that final sanding. So that is important, because if you don't, if you put the egg wash on without raising the grain, it will in turn raise the grain. So what you've sealed is now like this. You want to have it as smooth as possible. If it has a little texture, it's fine, because once you start coating it and sanding back, you're going to knock off any of that little bit of, you know, texture that you're feeling. It's not, it really isn't a problem.
Okay, so you just mentioned something essential in that first 20 minutes. Anything else you want to review for anyone else? I'll listen.
Well, I don't know. Ask me specifically what you're thinking about.
Okay, materials needed, your list covers that pretty well.
Right.
Making a pad.
Making a pad, I use this one here that I've got is quite old, and it's a raw cotton fiber fill, and it kind of, somebody mentioned they use lamb's wool for their pad. That sounds fine. You could probably use regular medicinal cotton if you wanted to use that, although it's a little springy. The essential part of it is to get it so it's really compact and firm. You can come up and feel this pad. It's very firm. It's not squishy at all. It's very firm and compressed over, and it's been very firmly compressed over time, and that's important to the technique. So whatever material it is probably isn't as important in terms of exactly what it is, but it should be. Now, here's something to note, that if you keep going with the sandpaper and you get a little bit of loading up, you may end up with little flecks that want to stick to the guitar. So it's time to get another piece of sandpaper. Usually you can just sort of pop these off if they're sticking, or sand them off, because
I used to suck them off on a vacuum thing for a while. That worked pretty good.
well, I think what you're doing is basically you've got this powder that's generated from sanding, and you're warming it up, and it will sort of clump as a result a little bit. And you can see, well, you can see the powder. It's kind of a mess. All right, so I'm getting close here.
What is it for the second and third coat of the egg wash? You get on the egg one and absorb?
Well, there's only one coat of egg wash you put on.
Only one?
There's just one
Some
coat.
of it soaks in and some of it doesn't.
Yeah. Well, if you get uneven absorption on the egg wash, that's probably mostly due to whatever wood you're working with, because the egg wash is is absorbed in the surface to a certain extent, but it's not, it's not, the wood isn't like a sponge. It doesn't soak up. The surface of the wood doesn't soak up as much. Recently, last year, and I learned this last year, it became maybe more apparent to me than it had before. I was doing a project in which I was going to have a spruce top that was really quite dark, stained very dark for a special project for a guy. And so I did a lot of tests. I took pieces of spruce. I bought stain from that aniline stain from Stumac, and I would mix it up and I would apply it, spray it on with a pre-valve sprayer. So I got, samples of spruce that were stained really dark brown, dark tobacco brown. And these were pieces of spruce that were actual cutoffs at the top that I was using. So you know, I sent them down to him, and he looked at them and said, oh, yeah, okay, that's a good color, maybe lighter, whatever. So what I would do is I thought, well, you know, I don't want to put the color on a different piece of spruce, so I thought, well, maybe I'll just try sanding these off so I could, you know, recoat them. And I discovered that stain didn't penetrate very far into that spruce. I was able to easily sand it right down to the wood very quickly. So even an aniline alcohol-based stain that you thought really would have just like soaked halfway through the thickness of the wood really didn't soak much beyond that very superficial surface layer. So it was interesting to note that the wood did not suck it up like you might think it would. And it's the same with the spit coat or the egg wash that you're putting on. It's not, it doesn't go as deeply as you think it might. And if you see some, as long as you're putting it on wet enough, you should get it absorbed into the surface as much as it's going to go. And any anomalies you see are in the wood and not necessarily in your application.
Once you've got your saturated mix, I'm a little light on exactly like how, like I'm mostly, everything I've read was always like 1 pound cut, 2 pound cut.
Right.
Like the scale out, I'm trying to, you know, devise these very accurate mixes. And it seems like you're not really concerned, well, you're concerned, but not like to the point where you're mixing up like a canvas.
Yeah, the actual cuts that I end up with really aren't of any concern in terms of what they really are. I just know, I know what they are in reference to where I started.
So through those real quick, just like the wash coat is like around, like what the loose.
Navy wash coat would be the supersaturated material cut by half, 50% roughly. And then the first bodying coats might be 60-40, that being 60% shellac, 40%. You know, and I'm just sort of coming up with arbitrary guesses as to where they really are here. You'll know if you're a little too, if your cut's a little too heavy or light in practicality as you work through. And it's easy to adjust it by putting in, if you've got a lighter mix than you really think is good, you can add a little shellac. Or if you're a little heavier than you want to be, you can add a little thinner. You can adjust this, and you'll eventually get a good feel for where you want to be. And you know, one thing I sometimes do is put a little shellac in my fingers and see how long it takes to, you know, it's sticky, and in 45 seconds it's like dry. So that's useful too. You know, you want that shellac to be sort of dry to the touch within maybe a minute of it. You know, of a thin layer of it being exposed to the air. Because that's important for the technique in terms of the lapping.
Do you have just a guess of what cut your super saturated is? Any guess at all? Like, oh, it's probably like a 2 pound.
Probably, I don't know. They talk about a 2 pound cut, but I don't know if 2 pound per, that's 2 pounds of shellac per what? What, a gallon of shellac? A gallon of, what's a gallon of alcohol? Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know if that approach is super saturated or not. Yeah, I really don't know. I haven't taken a gallon of 2 pounds of shellac and mixed it into a gallon of alcohol.
Well, this scale. It is scalable.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of commercial. You know, that's sort of a commercial. If you buy a gallon of shellac from somebody in a can, which I don't recommend you do, but and it says 2 pound cut. You know, that's you know sort of like buying a dozen eggs.
Use seal coat ever?
Hmm?
You ever use the seal coat that was developed by Sensor to be stable for I think up to 3 years or something in a can? It's de-waxed.
Yeah, I don't, and I talked yesterday about some of this proprietary things like Royal Lac and some of these other. I know Zinsser. I've used a lot of Zinsser shellac over the years for other things other than
The
guitar.
seal coat's the de-waxed one. I think Mike Dresner helped them develop it.
Right. I haven't used it, but you know, if it's convenient and seems reliable to people, then it's probably okay, as long as it goes on and dries sufficiently. The problem with all of the packaged stuff is you don't know how long it's been sitting on the shelf. So if you happen to get, if you get something that's old, it may not, there's always a possibility that it just might not dry as well as you want it to dry. This is why I always favor getting shellac in flake form and mixing it. And then I date it, put a date on the bottle. So, I mean, and I'll probably work out of this, as I said yesterday, for about a year at least, because it'll be perfectly good. In fact, the initial coats that I mixed this up before I came down, but the initial coats that I used on this guitar were a year old, was a quantity that I mixed up last summer. So, it was just fine, dried well, no problem. Yeah.
It's going to be off the wall here, but is it possible to do subtle color gradations? Sunburst is obviously the one that everybody knows. But
Yeah, you can do.
instances I can think of where you might want to have some section a little darker than the rest.
Yeah, you can do that, but I would. It's very difficult to control the amount of shellac that you put on, and in terms of color, it would be very subtle. You're much better off doing that color work with some sort of a stain or whatever, in terms of, it's not,
Prior to finish.
the challenge with French polish is getting an even color.
Yeah, I know.
And attempting, a gradation of color, you might be able to do it, but I think you would probably end up getting a rag soaked in alcohol and starting over, because it would be, it's not controllable to that degree, and you don't have enough variation, I think, in the color. And even though when you look at shellac in this kind of packaging, you can see the difference in color. Once you mix it and have, looking at 1/1000th of an inch thickness, there's not a lot of difference. It's the accumulation of that color that starts to work with you or against you. So if you had 4 different colors of shellac and you were trying to do like a sunbursted finish, you might be able to do something approximating. You might get something where somebody would notice, yeah, it's a little darker here, and yeah, it's lighter here, but whether or not you can get a smooth gradation in between the colors or much contrast between the colors would be questionable.
I was thinking more in terms of something a little darker somewhere that obscure a lawn.
Right. Well, that's an idea. You might be able to do it if it was very localized and in an area where you could really concentrate that darker color and sort of in a.
And then feather out.
Yeah, right. And if it was a little bit more of an unobtrusive area and that sort of thing, as opposed to, and over darker wood, you could probably get away with that. Sure. Yeah.
You have the dry flakes go bad over time?
Yeah, I think they do, but I've never really. I only encountered it once where I had bought a large quantity of blonde shellac and it sort of all stuck together because of humidity in the air, I think, and I just never used it. I never really found out whether or not it was, I had sort of moved beyond using the blonde shellac at that point, so.
I've read if you keep it in a tight container,
Right.
like of air and in the fridge,
Yeah.
it can last forever.
Yeah. The flakes are really, they are stable enough so that in normal usage, you really don't have to worry about them going bad on you. Yeah, Bear?
I'll make a note to myself for the fall guitar maker and Mike Collin from the director. I'll pack the burrows, breakdown of pound cuts for shellac, so you can then vary that in amounts and get what you want.
Yeah.
Might be useful.
Yeah, I think you could, if you're the sort of person that's very analytical about these things and want to have 5 bottles of shellac that are carefully measured to various cuts that you use in different phases of this process, which is really heavier shellac to thinner shellac as you go along, lower grits to higher grits as you go along, wetter application to drier application as you go along in sort of a general way. If you're the sort of person who likes to be that quantified about things, you could certainly do that. It's not me though. I know that's something I've worked on. Yes?
Is there ever a case to be made for skipping the sanding before you go to your glaze coat? Like, let's just say if you look at your surface and it at least appears to be really...
Well, some people actually don't sand, they scrape, they do a scraped surface. I mean, the old Spanish guitar makers, when you look at those old guitars, they didn't sand them, they scraped them, and you can see evidence of it. And the surface looks different than a sanded surface. So they went right from a scraped surface to French polishing. But you've got to really be good with a scraper to do that.
But is there ever a case for the saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? You know what I mean?
Right.
You look at it and you're just like, okay, this is great.
Well, if
Or
you've
is
got
there something else you get from the
If you've
sand?
got a darker wood and you want to basically fill in some sanding scratches with finish rather than actually sand them out, if there's some reason why you'd want to do that, you might be able to get away with it. But again, as I mentioned, there's not a whole lot of fill that happens with the shellac. So I don't know if you're talking about real defects, if you're just talking about a coarser texture that's left from, say, a lower grit, an 80 or 100 sandpaper, and not sanding between 100 and 150 or something. Is that what you're talking about? Or?
No, I'm talking about not sanding at all. I'm saying you've applied coats.
Right.
And if it appears...
Oh, you're talking about...
Maybe this level of perfection is just...
You're talking about applying the shellac itself.
Yeah, I'm talking about you apply the
Right.
shellac, and if you get to that final glaze coat and you look at it and maybe you're taking the gamble saying, I can apply this glaze coat and it might be...
Depends on the wood that you're using. The whole point of the sanding and the multiple coats is that each coat will fill your pores in the wood a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, and you're sanding the surface down closer to the fill that you're getting in the pore. Eventually, that pore fill will be level with your surface because you've built up the pore, built up the surface, but sanded it down, and you're sort of filling and refining that surface. If you don't sand, you're not going to get that effect. You're going to end up with you will end up with a shiny surface, but it'll be shiny but not refined. It's the sanding that refines the surface. That's at least the way I'm illustrating it here. The traditional French polish method uses things like spiriting off and different kinds of things to presumably smooth the surface, and it's quite, a lot of people say, well, I do it the traditional way, I still got swirl marks, what do I do? And that's what you end up with a lot of times, is swirl marks, because you're not really leveling the surface. You may be knocking down the high spots, but you still got, you're not refining that surface enough with the pad as you work it. So that's the whole point of the sanding. It's mostly because the commercial market for guitars is pretty persnickety about fit and finish. So if you want to sell guitars to the general public or clients, they better look good. More important that they look good than that they sound good, sadly, but that's the way it is. And the nicer they look, the better your fit and finish, the more you can get for them. Fit and finish is the tough part of this whole endeavor, but and a guitar with a sort of undeveloped, sort of raw-looking surface probably isn't going to sell as well as one that has a much nicer. Now, I'm not talking about the difference between a beautifully French polished guitar, which is equally appealing to my mind as a beautifully finished lacquer guitar. It has a different character to the finish, but it draws you in just as much as a beautifully lacquered finished guitar. I'm talking about finish that is not to the level of the surface being really sophisticated looking. And again, there is sort of a philosophical component proponent to adopting French polish and coming up. You know, I decided again a number of years ago that I wanted to come up with a different aesthetic for the guitars that I was making. They were classical guitars mostly, and I've been able to translate that aesthetic over into making replicas of like early style Martin instruments and antique guitars. You know, there's sort of a sameness to factory-made guitars and to a lot of guitars that are built by individual makers because they send them out to guys who finish them to factory standards. So they all basically look the same. You know, I've seen a few things where they had a different look, an equally nice look to some of that kind of stuff. But so you have to sort of unhitch yourself from following the factory aesthetic, which I followed slavishly for years and years and years. You know, the more I could get a guitar to look like it was built at the Martin factory, the better I did. You know, it was like, yes. but eventually you say, you know what? Why am I chasing that? I'm just one person working in my basement. I'm making a handmade guitar. I'm getting lost in the, if I produce something that looks like just everybody else makes, I'm just getting lost in the crowd. How can I create sort of an aesthetic that I can live with in terms of how I make it and where I do it, you know? And
when you're in that scene, then you better hope it sounds better.
Well, if you can't make a guitar that sounds better than a factory guitar, maybe it's time to look for something else. That's the easiest part of it. That's the easiest part right there. It's making it sound better. You should be able to do that without much trouble. Or at least as good. At least as good. But making it look as good as a factory-produced instrument, that's the hard part. All right, so here's the same material that I used yesterday, the body. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fit it additionally for this glazing portion. And for those of you who feel the need...
Scientific ratio.
Yeah, for those of you who feel the need to quantify this, it's probably around 60-40 at the moment, I'm guessing. You know, 60% thinner and 40% finish. So I'm going to add a little bit of carefully measured thinner here and probably bring it down to about 20 to 25% shellac, 70 to 75% thinner.
The one you started with looked a lot like a 1 pound shot.
Yeah. So I don't know what this would be, but it's pretty thick. So, okay. So now I'm going to be working with, I talk about working wet to dry. And your pad is always wet by definition because it has liquid in it. Okay, so when I say wet to dry, I'm talking about the amount of shellac that's charged into the pad being like easily squeezed out would be very wet, sopping wet. Okay, where I was working yesterday with this was sort of moderately to minimally wet, where it was fairly squeezed out and blotted, so it took a sort of only a moderate amount of pressure to express the shellac from the pad as I moved it across the surface. This is one order of magnitude above that, where it's going to be very thin shellac and really squeezed out from the pad. So it's to be very dry. It's what I call it. I'm going to work really dry here. And this is the, let's presume, you could actually go a few more cycles if you really wanted to with this. But for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to say, okay, we're done with the bodying sessions here. Now we're going to do the glaze, what I call the glazing, which is the sort of final thing. So I'm going to take my pad here in my Truvia plastic container. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, perfect for the pad, Truvia.
Sorry, David, I don't mean to beat a dead horse here, but when you say you end up with a 75-25,
right?
Is that in reference to your first mix?
Yeah. This is 100%. Yeah, this is 100% shellac. So 25% shellac to 75% thinner is sort of where I'm at. Yeah, exactly. So it's relative. What it really is in terms of pound cut, I have no idea. But it's sort of irrelevant because you've mixed this up yourself. You know what it is, and you can work back from it. And, all right, so I've pretty much gotten this well infused with this light, this thinner material. And I'll show you, here's a little trick that you won't see in the Milburn tutorial. Any of you have looked at that? No, anyway. Here's a trick that's not in the books. Basically, I take this, and I step on it. This is really squeezing it dry. It's getting all the excess shellac out of it.
How many pounds of pressure are we putting?
Probably about 125 pounds per square inch. Because it's about two square inches and I weigh 250 pounds, so.
18 stone.
So at any rate, yes. So now this is pretty dry. I mean, it's still got, it's still got a little bit of wetness to it, but
Can I
it's,
see a left before you?
yeah, sure. All right. And you can it's probably dry in your hand now before you sit down, right?
Yeah.
Very quickly, it dries very quickly. So because it's drier, it's going to take a little bit more force to do it. And you'll see something interesting that sort of gives you an indication of how much shellac is actually going down on this surface. Again, I'm using the same straight pulls as I did before. Yeah. And at this point, I'm using, this is thin enough so you've heard the term flashing off. You can actually see it flashing off at this stage, where you don't really see that as much in the previous stages that I was doing.
Okay, so you weren't getting that tail that was following the pad, you're only getting that now? Is that what you thought?
Yeah, well, flashing off to my mind is you can see the thinner evaporating from it. Now, look at this. You see that sort of stripy looking? Can you actually see that from where you are? Yeah. Sort of stripy. The surface is only forming at the lap. So, all right, so there's so little shellac going on there that the just one pass isn't creating a shine on the sanded surface. But where I've lapped it, you can actually see where it's starting to develop a shine. Okay, this is important. It's an indication of how much shellac I'm putting on there, which isn't much. It's very thin, very, very thin, applied dryly. So I'll move to the sides, do the same. At this point, where you've just charged the pad and squeezed it out, it moves pretty freely because it's still a little wet. As I progress with this, it's going to get a little harder to move, and you're going to have to apply a little bit more force and be a little bit more, hold it tighter and use a little bit more force to keep the pad moving as the amount of material in the pad is expressed out of it. And I won't re-wet the pad probably until I'm essentially done with this, because I don't want to, there's no...
So if you get into trouble at this stage, like your pad dries and it sticks and leave a little spot, so
Right.
you just let dry and then go back the next day.
You can always go over it and re-massage the surface.
Such a light coat, you just continue and it will break itself.
Yeah. Okay, so there's the initial coat on the sides. Maybe you can see the stripiness there too. We're getting some shine, but it's only at the lap, where it's lapping. So I'll do this again. Okay, still a little stripy, but building a little bit more. We're getting a little bit more of a complete surface showing itself there. Going on the side too.
So how many passes do you do at this point?
You know, it's probably going to end up being 3, it's probably more than 3, probably 4 to 5, and that'll be it.
And they're just continuous, one after the other.
Right. Again, you know, you're going to use your judgment. Seeing how well the surface is developed. Because you really want to try to keep the surface, this is at the point where you've leveled the surface and you smooth the surface, and you want to develop a shine on the surface, but you don't want to create any more texture to the surface than you have to. So, once you've developed that final surface that you're going to then polish up from, however you're going to treat the final surface, whether or not you want to, dull it down with steel wool, or whether or not you want to polish it up using compounds, you're not going to be presumably applying additional shellac. So,
And you're sanding with 800 grit sandpaper after each day of the...
Well, it depends. I mean, more commonly, the initial stages you might be, if you've applied a really thick initial sort of, if you really have some serious leveling to do, you can go down to 320 and then maybe 400 or 400. More typically it would be 400 or 600 before the 800. I'm sort of at a point now where I don't delve much below 600 even from the beginning, because I've gotten to the point where I can sort of get it on pretty smoothly, and I'm not overdoing it so that I have to really cut back a lot. So, and 600 is pretty aggressive, so I can usually level with 600 without much problem. Now at this point I'm going to dispense with this because I don't have much, there's not much polish in the pad, so I'm not too worried about expressing some out against the edge and getting an accumulation where I don't want it. So I'm more interested in getting a nice. So you can hear that. You can hear the pad on the surface.
Yep.
So you can sort of get a sense of the fact that it's being applied with a little bit of force, and that's the surface is developing.
And David, how important is it to keep that pad moving?
Very important. I mean, it's trickier at the earlier stages when you have more polish and when you're working on a surface that's already got a lot of polish, freshly applied polish. Here I'm working over the sanded surface, which tends, there's much less shellac on it, but yeah, you got to keep it moving.
That pad will dissolve the existing finish so quickly.
Well, each layer bonds itself to each successive layer, so you basically end up with a singular film of shellac on this thing. And it doesn't...
If you stop mid-stroke, you'll wind up with a little kiss mark.
That's right.
There's stinkers.
Yeah. And you saw yesterday where I went a little too far against recently applied, and it caught the pad and sort of rolled it in my fingers. At this point, there is a fair amount of resistance, and you start feeling a little bit of skiddiness to this thing. Pad may tend to skid a little bit. Try one more try. Sometimes if you got, if the pad is well charged and you're working against the surface, you can sometimes get a little bit more material that's already in the pad closer to the surface by squeezing it a little bit. Just sort of pushing it up towards the working surface. assists you a little bit to keep them smooth. So again, you're all invited to come up and take a closer look at this. And I think it's at the point now in terms of the surface where I could put that buffing compound on it and have it polish up very nicely. And
And you wait a day before you do that?
yeah, I would wait overnight. Although this will probably be dry enough to the touch by the time we leave here, because it's so thin.
When did you first put one in?
Yeah, I know, yeah. But see, this is what it looked like after this big coat.
Well, you had no shellac when you came to start the conference?
No, I'd already done two or three sessions of body, because I wanted to be able to illustrate this last facet of the process, and I can't do it on just something that I had just freshly bodied up. So I wanted to at least be able to show this last portion of the process without. So here, pass that around. You can just get a sense of how much material is in that, and get a sense of the weight and the feel of that pad in terms of how. So this might, if you wanted to polish this up, I might do a few more glazing passes on this. But if you wanted to polish it up, it's at a point now where, a buffing wheel and that number 85 would bring it up to a pretty bright level. Yeah, right. The thing is, you've already sanded that. There's already shellac there. You sanded it with 800. So, you can take an 800 sanded surface and buff that up from where it is with that 85 to a gloss.
Do you have to have a wheel?
I wouldn't recommend using like a floor buffer on this at all, because it generates way too much heat. The buffing wheel that I use is like a Stumac foam pad. And
Can you do it by hand?
yeah, you can do it by hand. But I find the foam pad is really sort of gives you a nicer polish, but you have to be careful not to get it hot, because you'll ruin it.
In your process, what day would this be?
It might be, I think I started bodying this up a couple weeks ago. So it usually takes me 3 to 4 weeks to do a French polish finish. And that's not, I'm not working every day on it. It just seems to, if I start a guitar and doing other things and letting things dry sufficiently in between and not pushing it, it seems to be.
So the extra time is for drying?
Yeah, I like to let things dry and shrink a little bit before I sand. It's sort of like shellac shrinks just like lacquer. And if you do a lacquer finish and you push the coats and you sand it nice and smooth and go back and look at it a month later, it's sunk in all the pores. So because shellac does the exact same shrinkage thing, I don't push it. I leave it. Let it dry. Make sure each sort of sequence dries sufficiently, because you don't want to end up with it being soft. If you layer it too thickly and you don't let it dry, it's going to take a long time to dry. So I really sort of don't push it. Work thin, let it dry adequately.
What do you end up with on the back and side of the deck?
I don't know. You tell me how thick you think that is. I mean, here's the raw surface with just a spit coat, and there's, we'll call that the finished surface. I don't know. It's certainly not 5 thousandths. It's probably not 3. It's probably under 2. Yeah, maybe 1.5. I don't know. I've never figured out a way to measure it. So.
Well, you lacquer, you spray. That's pretty easy.
Yeah, if you peel off a piece of lacquer, you take your micrometer and you can measure exactly what your film is, you know. But this is not the same as that at all. It's much thinner. Yeah.
I picked up on it. I guess I have a tendency to want to sand too much over sand. Kind of go out to the 400.
Right.
You said that it's better to stop below 200.
For bare wood sanding?
Yeah.
Yeah. Martin only sands their stuff out to 180, I think. Yeah. You need a certain amount. They call it tooth. You want to have enough surface for any finish to sort of bond to, and you're building up that surface with finish. So yeah, you don't need to sand beyond. You could go to 220 if you really have the anal. As long as things are smooth and there aren't any chatter marks or ripples or unevennesses or whatever, I mean that's the most important thing. Yeah, this is the Wonder Red. Yeah, just twisty ties. And I like the long twisty ties. Around Christmas time, when you get Christmas lights, they're packaged with these big long twisty ties. It's the only good thing about putting up Christmas lights, as far as I'm concerned, is that this was a ties. Yeah, right.
So you don't go through a lot of cloths?
No, I mean, maybe once or twice a year I change that if I'm doing a lot of well, because now this was brand new when I started. This was brand new when I started.
I just feel like, hey, it starts to...
Well, it's really if you're using like t-shirt material or the seat of an old pair of underwear or something, the wood is pretty abrasive. You can put a hole in that material.